Lady Jane Grey was born in 1537 into one of England's most powerful families, the Grey family. The great-granddaughter of Henry VII, Jane was linked by blood to the Tudor dynasty, and as such, her life was destined to intertwine with the volatile politics of the time. Her father, Henry Grey, was a nobleman, and her mother, Frances Brandon, was a granddaughter of Henry VII, making Jane a direct cousin to Queen Mary I and a great-granddaughter of the first Tudor king. However, Jane's path to the throne was not through birthright but through a combination of royal machinations and the unfortunate timing of her relatives' ambitions. During the reign of King Henry VIII, the political landscape of England was dominated by the question of succession. Henry VIII's famous 6 marriages, along with the religious turmoil caused by his break from the Catholic Church, created a tangled and precarious line of heirs. When Henry VIII died in 1547, his son Edward VI ascended to the throne. Edward, a Protestant, was just 9 years old, and his minority opened a period of uncertainty over the future of the English monarchy. It was during this uncertain time that Jane Grey's rise began. As the granddaughter of Henry VII's daughter, Jane was a legitimate heir to the throne, but her claim was not the strongest. Jane was a Protestant, and during the reign of Edward VI, the country had leaned strongly towards Protestantism. In 1553, when Edward VI was gravely ill, the king's advisers and supporters feared that the Catholic Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, would restore Catholicism to England. In a bold political move, they sought to bypass Mary's claim to the throne in favor of Jane Grey, a Protestant who was seen as a safer option for maintaining the Protestant reforms in England. Lady Jane was married to Guilford Dudley, the son of John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland and one of Edward VI's most powerful advisers. The Dudleys had ambitious plans to secure their family's power, and by placing Jane on the throne, they hoped to solidify their influence. On Edward VI's deathbed in 1553, the young king signed a will that named Jane Grey as his successor, effectively disinheriting his sisters Mary and Elizabeth. With the approval of Northumberland and the Royal Council, Jane was proclaimed Queen of England on July 10, 1553. However, Jane's reign would be anything but glorious. She was a mere pawn in the power struggle between the nobility. At just 16 years old, Jane had neither the experience nor the desire to rule. She had been pushed into the role of queen, and although she was intelligent and well-educated, her reign was fragile and lacked the support of the people. The very day she was crowned, rebellion was brewing. Mary, the rightful heir, and her supporters rallied in the south of England, gaining momentum rapidly. Within just 9 days of Jane's accession to the throne, the forces loyal to Mary had captured London, and Jane was deposed. Mary was declared queen, and Jane's brief reign was over. Jane Grey's fall from power was swift and dramatic. She was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London, and her political career came to an abrupt and tragic end. But while Jane's reign was short, it marked the beginning of a series of tragic events that would ultimately transform her from a pawn in a political game to a martyr for her faith. Jane's death would be a shocking and unjust one, but her legacy as a symbol of innocence, virtue, and Protestant martyrdom would endure for centuries to come. After Jane Grey's deposition, she was locked away in the Tower of London, and her future seemed uncertain. At first, Queen Mary I, a staunch Catholic, seemed reluctant to execute her cousin. However, the political realities of the time quickly took hold. The supporters of Jane's brief reign were seen as traitors to Mary, and their punishment was inevitable. Mary's advisers, including the powerful Duke of Norfolk, were insistent that Jane, as a claimant to the throne, posed a threat to Mary's rule. Though Jane had never truly ruled in any meaningful way, her very existence represented a challenge to Mary's legitimacy. Mary had long viewed Jane's brief reign as a symbol of Protestant rebellion, and the whispers of further uprisings from Jane's supporters only increased her resolve to silence the potential threat. Jane, however, was never a real threat to Mary's reign. She had been a victim of manipulation and had never wanted power. But in the eyes of the Catholic Queen Mary, Jane had to pay the ultimate price for her connection to Protestantism and her role in the rebellion against the legitimate heir to the throne. Despite being a pawn in the political struggle, Jane was forced to confront the dire situation in which she found herself. Jane's time in the Tower was marked by fear, uncertainty, and pressure from her jailers to renounce her Protestant faith. She had been raised as a devout Protestant and, despite her young age, she had already embraced the tenets of the Reformation. Though she was urged to convert to Catholicism, Jane remained steadfast in her beliefs. She refused to abandon her Protestant convictions, and her determination to die for her faith would become one of the most striking aspects of her legacy. The tension of Jane's imprisonment was not just political but also deeply personal. Jane's family had been betrayed. Her father, Henry Grey, and her husband, Guilford Dudley, were both implicated in the failed rebellion that had placed Jane on the throne. Guilford Dudley was executed first, and Jane, despite her unwavering innocence, was forced to watch as the love of her life was led to the scaffold. For Jane, the prospect of her own death was beginning to feel inevitable. As the days passed, the authorities began to draw up the charges against her. Jane was accused of high treason for claiming the throne of England, and her actions were considered acts of rebellion against Mary's rule. The trial itself was a formality. Jane had little hope of avoiding the death sentence. The Protestant cause that she represented was in disarray, and the Catholic Queen Mary, determined to secure her throne, was unwilling to show mercy to anyone she perceived as a threat. The trial of Lady Jane Grey took place in November 1553, with Jane standing before a court that had already decided her fate. She was found guilty of high treason and sentenced to death by beheading. Her fate seemed sealed, but there was still hope that Mary might grant her mercy. Queen Mary, despite her intense desire to eliminate any threat to her rule, was reportedly moved by Jane's youth and innocence. The decision was ultimately made to delay her execution, but this only prolonged Jane's agony. Lady Jane Grey's execution was set for February 12, 1554. By now, she had become a symbol of Protestant martyrdom. Jane had been a pawn in the grand game of politics, but she had shown great courage in her final days. She was resolute in her faith and her refusal to recant her Protestant beliefs, and this would be her ultimate sacrifice. On the morning of her execution, Jane was led to the scaffold outside the Tower of London. She was dressed in a simple gown, her face pale but composed. She was allowed to speak to the crowd, and in her final speech, Jane declared her loyalty to God and the Protestant faith. She expressed her regret at being forced into the political machinations that had led to her downfall but declared that she had always acted with good intentions. As the executioner prepared to strike the fatal blow, Jane was calm, her faith unwavering to the end. Her execution was quick. The axe fell, and Jane Grey, the young and innocent girl who had briefly been Queen of England, was dead. The crowd, which had gathered to witness her death, was filled with sorrow and sympathy for the young martyr. Her tragic end, the unjust execution of a young girl who had been used as a pawn in a political game, left a deep mark on the English conscience. Though she was gone, Jane's death became a symbol of Protestant sacrifice and a rallying cry for the Protestant cause in England. The shocking and unjust execution of Lady Jane Grey marked the end of her brief life but not the end of her legacy. Over time, she became a martyr for the Protestant cause, and her death would inspire generations of Protestants in England to continue the struggle for religious freedom. Her story became a powerful example of the personal costs of political ambition and the dangers of using individuals as pawns in power struggles. Lady Jane Grey's martyrdom would eventually be remembered as a tragic tale of innocence lost in the political machinations of the Tudor dynasty. She was a hero to some, a victim to others, but in the end, her story stands as a reminder of the dangers of ambition, manipulation, and the high price that some must pay for the cause of faith.